Today we're continuing with our ocean sunset painting from last week. In the last video, I focused on the water element of the painting, which is where the bulk of the action and the detail in the image occurs. Today we're completing the remaining elements, the sky, the moon, and the sand. We'll also look at a simple technique to help soften some of the effects in the water and to help create a sense of distance and atmosphere within the image. To paint the water, we used relatively simple brushwork and layered it up with a step-by-step approach to build up the details. Today I'm teaching you how to make a wash and how to apply a dry brush scumble. Plus, I'll be showing you how I correct mistakes and make refinements. The color palette once again includes titanium white, pyrrole red, Prussian blue, cobalt blue, yellow ochre, and cadmium yellow light. The reference images you need are both on my Instagram page at Art Classes Online with Christy, or see the links below the video. We'll start by mixing up a fairly pale blue color for the bottom of the sky, using lots of titanium white and a bit of cobalt blue. We mainly used Prussian blue to paint the water. Today we're mainly using cobalt blue. This needs to be a very liquid paint mixture, so add plenty of water. We also need to add a few drops of water-based acrylic gloss varnish or satin varnish to prevent our paint from becoming underbound. When you add a lot of water to acrylic paint, there's a danger of it becoming underbound, meaning that it doesn't stick properly to the paint layer beneath. So once it dries, it can eventually powder off or be washed off the surface. We literally only need to add a couple of drops of varnish and mix it through thoroughly. This kind of very liquid paint application is called a wash. I started by applying the wash with the painting standing upright on the easel, but I found I wasn't able to spread the paint evenly enough. So I simply washed off the wet paint. I did that by brushing clean water onto the surface, which is what I'm doing here, and then I wiped it up with a paper towel. I didn't capture that step on video. I've laid the panel flat on the table instead. There's still a tiny bit of blue paint left on the surface, but it's mostly gone. Here we go, ready to do it again. I'm trying to spread my paint as smoothly and evenly as possible. I'm thinning out the top edge of the blue paint by brushing it with extra water so that it kind of visually blends into the pink background. It's not necessarily the easiest way of doing it because you can quite easily disturb and remove the paint you've already laid down. It's probably easier to apply the paint as normal and then wipe along the top edge of the blue paint with a paper towel to thin it out. You can try both methods and see which one works best for you. Using the hairdryer to ensure this paint layer is completely dry before I apply a second thin wash over the top to build up the coverage. With this second layer, I'm not going quite as far up because I want to keep the paint along the top edge a bit thinner so the color visually blends into the pink. Again, trying to spread the wash as evenly as possible. If you find you're picking up and removing the paint from beneath, then your layer might not have been properly dry or you didn't mix enough varnish into your wash. I'm doing a tiny touch-up just along the horizon line where I left a tiny gap of pink showing. Now I'm going to soften that very sharp horizon line by brushing some of our wash over the top, then wiping off most of it with a paper towel. The thin veil of paint that's left on the surface just softens the crisp brushwork and gives the illusion of distance and atmosphere, creating a greater sense of depth within the painting. I'm also applying a very thin layer of wash over these two areas of water between the waves, which has a couple of purposes. It will help to soften the contrast in these areas a little. I felt the highlights of the foam patterns were a bit too pale, and this helps them to blend into the color of the water a little more. Adding the wash also helps to create a color balance by bringing some of the sky color into the water. If you apply it a bit too thickly, then just wipe some of it off again with a paper towel. I didn't need to do that. I'm adjusting the color by adding a tiny bit of Prussian blue, which is the color we primarily used for the water. And I'm applying that over this thin veil of water along the front to tone down some of the bright pink. Keeping the brush marks very horizontal to give that effect of a reflective water surface. I'm mixing up a pale yellow wash for the top of the sky, using lots of white and a little yellow ochre. I'm comparing it to the blue I mixed for the sky to determine the relative intensity of the color I need. Mixing it with plenty of water. Then mixing it with a couple of drops of acrylic varnish. I've applied a bit too much paint onto the panel, or maybe the paint is still a little too thick, because I'm brushing it out, but I'm just finding it too intense. I could have wiped some of the paint off with a paper towel to reduce the thickness and then possibly kept going. But off camera, I actually brushed clean water onto the surface and then removed the paint again with a paper towel. Sometimes it's just easier to start again. There's still a very thin veil of the yellow layer remaining on the surface, which is fine. Now with slightly more diluted paint and slightly less paint on the brush, I'm giving it a second go. That's the good thing about this technique. Even though it can be a bit tricky to achieve a good, thin, even layer, if it doesn't look good, you can wash the paint off quite easily, as long as you decide quickly while the paint is still wet. Don't forget you can practice the technique on your mock-up first before doing it on the final painting. Making sure you dry the paint thoroughly with a hairdryer before continuing. I'm going to apply a second layer just along the top. Again, using a very thin application of the paint and not going down quite as far with the wash as for my first layer. The second layer tends to smooth out any minor irregularities and unevenness you may have had in the first layer. Now using the same very liquid paint, I'm applying some yellow along the bottom of this section of water to serve as a reflection of the sky. And I wipe away some excess paint gently with a paper towel. In order to finish off this bottom section of the water, I'm mixing up the same color that we used as the underlayer for the foam caps and for the foam patterns on the surface of the water. A pale muted lilac blue made with lots of white and a small amount of cobalt blue, Prussian blue, and Pyrrole red. I'm using it to create some pale reflections and a suggestion of thin foam trails on the surface of this section. Using fairly large brush marks because larger marks suggest things that are closer to the viewer, while smaller brush marks imply distance. And going over some areas a second time to strengthen them, because the paint I'm using is pretty thin. Now it's time to paint the sand. This is probably our hardest color mix for the entire project. We're using all the primary colors. So starting with plenty of white, then adding small amounts of Pyrrole red, cobalt blue, and yellow ochre. This is close to the color that I want, but I need a little bit more intensity and a bit more warmth. So I'm adding more of the red and yellow. The color is fairly orange to give the effect of the pink sky reflecting off the yellow sand. If you want it to be a bit more yellow, just add more yellow ochre. If you want it to be slightly more gray, then add more blue in your mixture. Take the time to get to a color that you like and test a bit on the edge of your painting or your mock-up. I'm applying the paint with my large flat brush using a relatively flat brush mark, but as you can see there's still a bit of irregularity in the mark, and I'm also not creating full coverage. There's still a bit of the pink base color showing through from beneath. That's what we want. You don't want your paint layer to be too flat looking. Now using half of the paint that I still have left on my palette, I'm mixing in more blue to get to a grayish version of the color I just used. This is for the area of wet sand near the water line. Using the side of my small flat brush to create a crisp line along the water's edge, then spreading the paint further down. Again, not making the paint layer too thick. There's still some of the orange paint showing through from beneath. Coming down the painting even a bit further with the same color. Now adding even more blue, a touch more red also, to darken up my color. This is for the darkest line of wet sand just at the water's edge. Testing it on the painting, I realize I've gone a bit too blue, so I'm mixing it with a little more of my original orange color. And painting that in using the side edge of my small flat brush. Now I'm lightening my original color for the sand, simply adding more white. You could add a bit more yellow as well if you wanted to. Then wiping the excess paint off my brush onto the paper towel, because we only want a bit of paint on our brush for this. Switching to my large flat brush, I'm applying the paint with fairly light pressure, wiping the brush in short horizontal and diagonal strokes to create this broken paint effect, where the paint naturally develops a slightly dotted pattern. A lot of people call this a dry brush effect. It's actually a little more like a paint scumble, where you use a lighter color over the top of another color that's already dry, and you're applying it somewhat unevenly to create that irregular, broken, and dotted effect. I'm doing it quite gently here, just wiping the little bit of paint I have on my brush onto the surface. Sometimes it works better with a stiff bristle brush and with even less paint on your brush, and then more or less scrubbing it across the surface. That's really hard on your brushes though, so if you want to give that a try, you could use your paint mixing brush instead of this soft bristle brush. As you can see, I'm using my small flat brush now to place a scumble at the start of the wet sand, just to soften that boundary between the wet and dry sand. That's what scumbles are also very good at doing, softening and blending a color transition. I'm going over this area near the center a second time to create a bit of a highlight there, making sure I keep my brush mark very irregular, because if you apply several layers of scumbling over each other, the effect does tend to smooth out and become more and more even, which I want to avoid. So just keep that in mind if you want to apply a second layer of the scumble. And this is the final effect. I think that dotted effect of the paint imitates the granular sand really well. So we finished the sand, and this is what the painting looks like. I'm very happy with it, but I'll let you in on a little secret. This was not my first attempt at painting the sand. Full disclosure, I had a go at it previously and it didn't turn out well. I started by painting the wet sand a very cool grey colour, and the dry sand was a very warm orange, but the colours were too dissimilar and unconnected, and once I had blocked them in, I couldn't find a way of connecting them. So I decided simply to start again. I painted out what I had done using the pink background colour. It's not how I would usually fix a mistake in my paintings, but it's probably the easiest way for this particular painting because the background plays such a big role in the final look and colouring. I didn't want to just paint over the sand with a new colour because I would lose that effect of the pink background showing through from underneath. I actually applied 2 layers of the pink to get good coverage. Then I started again with the colours you see now. If you slip up on any part of this painting, like the sky or even a section of the water, I would recommend going back to your base colour and starting again. So back to our painting. Looking over it again, I realize I want to break up this strong dark blue line of the wave. I feel it looks too solid and block-like in relation to the rest of the image, and it kind of blocks the natural flow of your eyes around the painting. I'm going to add a patch of aqua water within the wave to help break up that strong shape. Mixing up the colour using Prussian blue, cadmium lemon yellow, and white, and testing it on my painting with a couple of tiny brush marks. I'm applying it at the center of the wave with my small flat brush and my pointed round brush, and I'm following the diagonal brush marks that were already there originally. I realize as I'm applying it that the color is still quite dark, and so lightening it up, adding more white. Going back over the area that I just painted. While I've got this shade mixed up, I'm adding a bit more Prussian blue to it and applying it in a small area at the front of the water, adding some darker ripples there to help balance the dark wave further back. On drying, the aqua I've just added within the wave is still too dark, so lightening it up again with a bit more white and applying it again. I prefer to keep lightening the color for the wave gradually than to go in too bright straight away. Now I'm mixing a lighter version of this blue color I used in the foreground wave. And adding a few small strokes of this color within the thin veil of water at the front, just to create more tonal variation in this area. Then going back over and lightening some of these marks to soften them. Now working back into the wave with an even lighter, brighter shade of aqua. Not going up as far into the wave with it so that some of the darker shades of the color are still visible along the edges to create a color transition. And I'm applying a second coat of the same bright shade to brighten the area further. It's finally time to position our moon in the sky. I'm placing it just above this peak in the wave, which is where our vertical grid line was originally. Therefore, according to the rule of thirds, I know it makes a good placement for the focal point of the painting. Mixing a tiny bit of yellow ochre into white. And plotting in our moon with the pointed brush. Then carefully sharpening up the edges. I'm mixing up a pale pink because I'm going to show you a trick I use quite a lot. I want to blend the moon into the sky slightly because at the moment it looks like a painted dot on the surface, and I want it to look more integrated into the sky. I'm applying my pink pale paint just inside the contour to help soften it and visually blend it into the sky. To finish off the moon, I'm mixing white and some cadmium yellow, but keeping the color very pale, close to white. Then applying some thick dots of this color near the center of the moon. This creates a nice glowing highlight. Then working out the placement for the reflection, and with 3 short horizontal brush marks, painting the reflection. This is where we are now with the painting. At this point, I put it aside for a couple of weeks before coming back to it to reassess. It's always a good idea to take a decent break from your work so you can review it with fresh eyes. I'd actually already signed my painting before deciding to make a few tweaks. I realized looking at it again that for me, the tops of the white foam caps are very flat and linear and not entirely naturalistic. Also, the line of foam second from the front is very straight and regular. These require only small changes that are not difficult to make. The hardest part is mixing up the right color to match what's already there. The base color for the foam was a mix of white and small additions of red, cobalt blue, and Prussian blue. I'm checking the color match at the edge of my painting before using it. I'm adding the color in a few places along the top edge, creating some bumps and irregularities and less of a straight line. I'm using my small pointed brush so that I can be quite accurate with where I place the paint. When you're painting, especially when you're close to finishing, try not to become a slave to the reference image. At that stage, you need to consider your reference photo as a source of inspiration and a starting point for your painting, rather than as an end goal. At a certain point, the painting will develop a life and a form of its own. At that point, try to assess the painting in its own right, without too much comparison to your photo. You can take elements you enjoy in the photo and introduce them into your painting, rather than trying to replicate your photo. Go for making small adjustments rather than making huge changes that remodel the whole painting. I think a really good question to ask yourself is, what small tweaks can I make that push my painting closer to the vision that I had for it? And are these changes easy to achieve? If the changes you want to make are difficult to achieve, then you may be overreaching and trying to change too much. Try to think of a simpler, more minimal approach. I'm mixing up the highlight color so that I can add a few extra highlights as well. Lots of white and a touch of red. Again, using my pointed brush and adding some tiny dots of foam spray in only a few places. I'm avoiding adding the same level of detail in all areas of the painting because it's only a small painting and it can easily start to look too busy and fussy. Large paintings leave a lot more space for details, but small paintings benefit a lot from simplification. I also want to work a little more on the sky. I want to make the transition between the blue and the pink a little softer. And I want to make the band of yellow near the top a bit stronger and more defined. I'm using the pink that I saved when I painted the base layer, and I'm mixing it with clean water and a couple of drops of acrylic varnish. I'm spreading it as evenly as I can along that intersection between the two colors using my small flat brush. This is a transparent or rather a translucent wash, so it doesn't completely cover the blue paint beneath. It will become more transparent as it darkens and dries. I'm adding a second application once the first layer is completely dry, only applying it where I most want it. I'm creating a kind of long cloud shape just in case the paint doesn't blend in completely with the background. It will look like a cloud formation. I'm mixing up the yellow for the top part of the sky, lots of white with a bit of yellow ochre. Mixing clean water into the paint and adding a couple of drops of the acrylic varnish. I'm applying it evenly along the top edge using my large flat brush and not coming down as far as my initial layer of the yellow paint. Again, the paint will darken and become more transparent as it dries so that it blends in better with the background. This is where we are now. I'm very happy with how both the water and the sky look. I'm looking again at the sand though. I'd like to add a little bit more yellow to the sand. I think it looks a bit too orange. I originally made a mock-up version of my painting on watercolor paper, and I've just added another more yellow-colored scumble on the sand, and I like the result. Plus the color balances well with the yellow in the sky. So let's mix up the color using titanium white, pyrrole red, yellow ochre, and a bit of cobalt blue. I've been fiddling with the color, so I've ended up making quite a lot of the color, way more than I need. I'm using my small flat brush and wiping off excess paint on a paper towel for a fairly dry brush effect. Balancing my painting on the outer edge of my easel so that I can reach the bottom edge of the panel with my brush. I'm scumbling using mostly crisscross brush marks and slightly curved marks. Remember that if you apply several layers of scumbling over each other, the effect does tend to smooth out and become more even, which I want to avoid. so I'm intentionally making my brush marks quite irregular. The marks will tend to blend into the background color more as the paint darkens when it dries. I'm sorry, I have a blowfly in my studio. The changes I've made for the foam caps on the waves and the color adjustments in the sky and the sand are small and relatively easy changes for me to make. They were not truly necessary. I could have left the painting as it was and it would have held up. But making these adjustments means that I've achieved somewhat more naturalism, which was part of my original vision for the painting. Now I'm scrubbing the last bits of paint on my brush over the transition with the wet sand color to soften that transition. This is the final result. What I like most about the painting is that there's lots of activity and detail at the center of the painting in the water, and then the top and bottom sections are a lot quieter. They're places for your eye to rest. If you followed along with my tutorial, then I hope you like your final paintings too. Please let me know in the comments how it went. What worked well for you and what part did you find the most challenging?